October 2011. A damp, cold air enveloped the Patterson house, abandoned for more than half a century on the edge of Ashford's forest in Connecticut. The beam from Inspector Lydia Freeman's flashlight cut through the pitch-black darkness, shining down onto cracked concrete that no one ever thought still held anything. Central? I need the excavation team and forensics to the old Patterson site immediately. Her voice echoed off the rotting walls. What began as a simple cold case file review had now become something entirely different. Something that would finally answer the questions that had haunted Ashford for 55 years. Because beneath that heavy layer of concrete lay a small piece of bone, and right beside it, a silver bracelet engraved with the initials AC, the very bracelet that 13-year-old Anna Kloss had been wearing the night she vanished in 1956. For more than half a century, Anna's disappearance had been nothing but unanswered questions. A bright 13-year-old girl left home with baked goods for a neighbor and never came back. A kitchen light left burning until dawn. A back door standing wide open with no explanation. 2 empty chairs at every holiday. 2 bedroom doors her mother could never bring herself to close. Before we continue this shocking story, please take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten cases back into the light and make sure you never miss a future upload. The discovery at the Patterson house wasn't just the end of a missing person case. It was the first domino in a chain of events about to expose decades of buried secrets in this small Connecticut town. Because when authorities finally identified and arrested the suspect in 2011, it wasn't a stranger or some nameless predator. It was someone the community knew. Someone they had trusted, someone who had lived among them for 55 years carrying this horrific secret. The Kloss case isn't just a mystery solved. It is a testament to the perseverance of a family that never stopped searching. Investigators who refused to let the file gather dust, and the power of modern forensic science that finally gave voice to a victim silenced for generations. It is also the story of a community torn apart. When Anna vanished, suspicion spread through Ashford like wildfire. Neighbors eyed each other warily. Families stopped talking. That desperate search exposed deep cracks beneath the surface of a small American town. Cracks that would split wide open when the truth finally came to light after 55 years. What makes this case especially haunting is that the answer was always so close, hidden right inside the house police once overlooked. The prime suspect had been interviewed during the original investigation, but slipped through the net. For decades, he attended Anna's memorial services, looked her parents straight in the eye, and maintained an innocent facade while concealing an unimaginable truth. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. I'm always curious how far these stories travel and how they connect us across vast distances. Tonight, we're going back to October 1956, following a search for answers that lasted more than half a century, and uncovering the twist that shook all of Connecticut in one of New England's most chilling cold cases. This is a story of loss, perseverance, deception, and ultimately justice delayed, but not denied. Ashford is a small town in eastern Connecticut, where narrow roads wind between rows of red maples and late autumn cornfields. In 1956, it was so peaceful that people still called it the town that never locks its doors. The Kloss family lived on the southern edge, in an old 2-story wooden house overlooking the forest. James worked at the local machine shop, and Denise sewed for the town's general store. Both were known as kind and respectable people. Their daughter Anna, 13 years old, was an 8th grader at Ashford Middle School, quiet and well-behaved, who often helped her mother bake every Saturday night. That evening, a damp chill blew in from Lake Ashford, and dim streetlights glowed over roofs covered in dry leaves. In the Kloss kitchen, Denise was cooling a fresh tray of apple pies while James sat at the table, buried in the newspaper. Anna carried a small plate with 6 pies and said she was taking them a few houses down to Mrs. Weller, the widow who lived alone. She slipped on her green sweater, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and went out the back door. Denise called after her to come home before it got completely dark. When the living room clock struck 8, James realized she still wasn't back. He stood up, stepped onto the porch. The yellow light fell on the empty dirt road, leading toward the woods. Denise dried her hands, phoned Mrs. Weller. The woman on the other end was surprised and said Anna had never stopped by. The couple looked at each other in silence. James grabbed his coat and flashlight and went outside. He walked along the fence, shining the light on the dirt path, then turned down the back lane. There was nothing but wet, fallen leaves. Denise ran to the neighbors, knocking on every door, but no one had seen the girl since dusk. A few people in the area started helping, walking around with flashlights, searching the woods, calling Anna's name into the misty darkness. The wind off the lake blew colder, carrying moisture that made the flashlight beams shimmer like silver. After nearly an hour of fruitless searching, James returned home, his face pale. Denise stood at the door, clutching her sleeve. He walked to the telephone on the table, looked around the silent kitchen, and picked up the receiver. His voice trembled slightly as he told the operator, "Our daughter, Anna Kloss. She's gone." On the other end, the operator quickly took the information and immediately called Police Chief Henry Lame. In his small office in downtown Ashford, Henry was reviewing the week's patrol logs when the phone rang urgently. He listened to the report, grabbed his hat and coat, and left the station at once. The road to the edge of town was deserted. Headlights cut dimly through the fog. When the patrol car stopped in front of the Kloss family's wooden house, it was almost 9:30 p.m. James opened the door, his face tense. Denise stood behind him, eyes swollen from crying. Henry introduced himself briefly, stepped inside, asked them to stay calm, and to tell him everything from the beginning. The kitchen still smelled of baked goods. On the table sat the empty plate and the half-read newspaper. He walked around, noting everything in his small notebook, the back door slightly ajar. No damage to the frame, dry floor, tidy living room, no signs of a struggle. In Anna's bedroom, the bed was neatly made, the closet door cracked open, the green sweater missing. Henry asked, "When was the last time you saw your daughter?" Denise replied that Anna had said she was taking pies to Mrs. Weller at the end of the street, and left right after. James added that she hadn't taken a flashlight, just her coat and scarf. Henry continued asking about recent visitors, anyone who had been to the house, any strangers in the neighborhood. James recalled a pickup truck parked near the lane a few days earlier. Denise said she'd heard an engine that morning but hadn't paid attention. He carefully wrote down every detail, time of last contact, direction she went, distance to the neighbor's house. After finishing the statement, Henry shone his flashlight around the backyard, along the fence and the path into the woods, checking the ground, grass and porch. Nothing obvious except wet leaves. He returned to the kitchen and told the Klosses to leave everything as is and not let anyone in or out. Then he signed the official missing person report and had the dispatcher send an internal alert to all patrol units. 2 officers were dispatched that same night, one to sweep the route from the Kloss house to the small creek north, the other to check along the highway out of town. Henry pulled out the Ashford map, marked the residential area around the Kloss home, and noted the priority search zones. Before leaving, he paused on the porch and asked one last time if they remembered anything unusual. Denise shook her head, saying the evening had just been unusually quiet. Henry nodded, told them to stay near the phone and report anyone who called or knocked. He stepped outside. The night wind blew harder, carrying the damp smell of the forest and lake through the wooden fence. As the patrol car pulled away, red and blue lights flickered on the wet road. In that moment, Henry glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the small Kloss house receding into darkness, the yellow glow in the window still burning like a silent plea in the cold night. He gripped the wheel tighter, feeling the heaviness spreading in his chest. The road ahead disappeared into thin fog, and as the car turned off Maple Lane, he knew Ashford's first search had officially begun. Back at the Ashford station, where Henry had just reported in, the night duty officer immediately mobilized everyone on shift. 3 patrol cars, 7 officers, and a volunteer fire and rescue team were called out. A large map was quickly spread on the briefing table, with key areas circled: the neighborhood around the Kloss home, the northern forest edge, the shores of Lake Ashford, and the road leading to the highway. Henry pointed and assigned tasks. Group 1 would check the entire route from the Kloss house to Mrs. Weller's. Group 2 would follow the forest edge. Group 3 would sweep the lake area and side roads leading to the old industrial zone. By then, wind from the lake was blowing hard, cold fog, blanketing the whole town. Volunteers carried flashlights and probing sticks. A few brought tracking dogs. Barking echoed in the empty night. Beams of light moved slowly along fences, sparkling in the mist. Henry went with Group 1. He walked and took notes, examining every footprint and tire track in the wet dirt. They stopped where the dirt road crossed the creek at the forest edge. An officer crouched down. Only soft mud and water, no clear prints. From afar, Group 2's siren sounded, nothing significant. Henry signaled to turn off the flashlights and listen. Only wind in the treetops and the crunch of falling leaves. Across the road, Group 3 was searching near the lake. The water lay flat, faint moonlight reflecting, only gentle ripples from the wind. Someone shone a light on the sandy shore. A few small shoe prints, blurred and mixed with afternoon fishermen's tracks. They marked the spot, took photos, and continued along the water's edge. Back in the neighborhood, 2 officers went door to door, asking if anyone had seen the girl or heard anything strange. Most said no. An elderly couple mentioned hearing a vehicle speeding on the main road around 8, but couldn't tell the direction. Henry noted it and ordered a check of all registered pickup trucks in the area. Near midnight, the groups regrouped at the intersection near the Kloss house. Everyone was exhausted, flashlights dimming, fog so thick visibility was limited. A young officer suggested Anna might just be lost, but Henry shook his head. The distance between the houses was too short for that. He ordered one more sweep around the lake before calling it. Meanwhile, James and Denise waited inside, every light in the house on, sitting at the kitchen table staring at the phone. Every time a car passed, Denise stood up, but it was only patrol units. Outside, wind still whistled through the trees, lights casting a pale gray glow through the fog. Around 3 a.m., Henry returned to the station. He collected all the reports and compiled the results from the 3 groups, residential area. No signs of forced entry or new evidence. Northern forest, no unusual footprints or suspicious items. Lake area, no signs of struggle or dropped objects, only a few indistinct shoe prints of undetermined age. The preliminary report concluded, no physical evidence related to the missing person recovered. Henry signed it, then looked out the window where dawn was slowly breaking, but the fog still hung thick, swallowing the distant trees in white. On his desk, the Ashford map with red circles around the Kloss house lay still, like a silent period at the end of the first fruitless night of searching. When the report was sent out at dawn, Henry realized the current scope had reached its limit, and local forces couldn't continue alone. He immediately contacted the Connecticut State Police, briefed them, and requested specialist support. By noon the next day, 2 state vehicles arrived in Ashford with tracking dogs, metal detectors, and detailed topographic maps. The search area was expanded north, where the creek flowed into the lake. More than 30 people formed 4 lines, walking 10 paces apart to avoid missing anything. The forest air was damp and heavy with mud. Fog hadn't fully lifted, even though the sun was high. Henry walked with the first group, taking notes and watching both banks of the creek. After nearly an hour, one officer spotted something glinting on the ground. He crouched, put on gloves, and picked it up. A thin silver bracelet engraved AC on the inside. Henry stepped over, carefully examined the mud on its surface, and sealed it in an evidence bag. He noted the exact location, distance to the Kloss house, direction of the creek flow, and wrote, "Item possibly belonging to missing person." He ordered a temporary barrier erected and a 10-meter radius secured. State forensic technicians immediately photographed the scene, numbered markers, measured distances from trees to the find. The team searched the surrounding area for another hour, but found nothing else noteworthy. The bank was wet, footprints overlapping, impossible to tell old from new. Henry ordered the scene sealed, stakes driven, and the technical unit called to take soil and water samples. Back at the temporary headquarters, he placed the bracelet on the desk. Its silver caught the faint light. Denise was brought in to identify it. She recognized it instantly, saying it was the bracelet Anna had worn since childhood, given by her father when she turned 10. James stood beside her, staring silently at the evidence. Henry made no comment, simply recorded the witness confirmation, completed the evidence form, signed it, and sent it to storage. After the paperwork, he held an urgent meeting with the state commander to reclassify the case. The summary report stated, recovered item highly likely belongs to victim location, approximately half a mile from disappearance site. No evidence of natural accident. Recommendation, reclassify as missing person with suspected criminal elements and expand search northward, approved that same afternoon. A field command tent was set up beside the creek. State police established temporary checkpoints on access roads, and patrol teams spread along the forest edge to ensure nothing was missed as daylight faded. Henry stood for a moment facing the gray water, listening to radio chatter mixed with the wind, knowing that from this point forward, the search had fully become a criminal investigation. As the sun set and the night shift took over, Henry returned to the command post near the creek to shift from field sweeps to evaluating every related location in the area. He opened the new files just received from state police, spread the Ashford map on the table, and with 2 officers began the next step, cataloging every residence, household, and facility within a 3-mile radius of the Kloss home. Inside that circle lay scattered homes, part of the northern forest, the road to the highway, and the old industrial area, abandoned since the early decade. He and the officers reviewed every road, numbering houses, warehouses, and service stations in the zone. A resident list was compiled from vehicle registrations and addresses. State technical staff printed a list of vehicles known to have been in the area the night of the disappearance, based on gas station logs and local garage records. From that list, Henry narrowed it down to 12 individuals whose personal vehicles had been within 3 miles of the Kloss home between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. He reorganized by occupation and travel times, then pinned colored markers on the map at each of their homes. There were carpenters, a mailman, shop owners, factory workers. Among them, one name made Henry pause longer than the rest: Jacob Patterson, 21 years old, mechanic at Eddington's gas station, living with his father on Maple Lane, just 3 houses from the Kloss family. Records showed Patterson owned a 1954 Ford pickup, dark red, single-axle, often used for hauling materials. A note from the previous night's patrol log mentioned a similarly colored truck seen on the main road near the time Anna disappeared. Henry circled the Patterson house in red and added a triangle marker for priority follow-up. He then sent investigative teams to verify every other address on the list. 3 units were formed, one for the northern residential area, one for roadside motels, one for the highway route. Each received the list, maps, and instructions to record statements. While awaiting results, Henry reviewed Patterson's civilian file again. Born and raised in Ashford, finished high school, worked at the garage since 16. No criminal record, no administrative violations. His garage boss described him as quiet, hard-working, keeps to himself. Additional note: mother died young, lives with father, rarely socializes with neighbors. Henry wrote in the margin, needs interview. Owns vehicle matching witness description. By late afternoon, the teams returned. Reports showed nothing unusual with the other 11 people. All had clear alibis, most at home with family or on evening shift at the factory. Only Patterson had no one who could confirm his whereabouts from 8 o'clock to 9:30 p.m. His father said, "My son was home listening to the radio, but couldn't recall exact times." Henry cross-checked the Eddington garage shift log. Patterson's shift that day had ended later than usual, around 7:45 p.m. The shift supervisor's handwritten note, "Stayed late to clean tools." Henry glanced at the clock and quickly jotted distance from garage to Kloss house, 3 minutes by car. He pinned a black marker at the garage, drew red lines connecting it to the Patterson house and the Kloss house, forming a tight triangle inside the suspect zone. The closer he looked, the shorter and more convenient the routes appeared, impossible to ignore. He told the night duty officer to prepare a summons for Patterson to come in for questioning and ordered the technical team to continue checking the truck's registration, chassis number, and paint records. By dusk, the map on the table was covered in symbols and lines. In the center, Henry's neat pencil note read, 3-mile radius around scene, focus, Maple Lane area, prime suspect #1, Jacob Patterson. Once the summons for questioning was sent, Henry spent the entire next morning double-checking every report from the previous night. While reviewing the witness list, a middle-aged woman named Mildred Owen, who lived at the end of Maple Lane, came to the station on her own initiative. She said that on the evening of the disappearance, while closing her small grocery store across from the road leading to the lake, she saw a red pickup truck driving very slowly with only one headlight on, then turning onto the stretch that connected to the Kloss neighborhood. She remembered it clearly because the license plate started with CT and the engine made a strange noise, like a slipping fan belt. Henry asked her to sit down, took a detailed statement, and confirmed the time was around 7:50 p.m. He showed her photos of registered vehicles in the area. She pointed straight at the 1954 Ford and said, "Exactly the one I saw." Henry immediately cross-checked the suspect vehicle list. Only Patterson owned that model, he noted. Witness statement matches description, requires direct verification. Around noon, Henry and 2 officers drove to the Patterson house at the end of Maple Lane. The small gray-painted house had a shed out back and a dark red Ford pickup parked in front, covered in road dust. Patterson answered the door, thin build, sleeves rolled up on his work shirt, eyes wary. Henry introduced himself briefly, explained the purpose of the visit, and asked if he had left the house the previous evening. Patterson answered in a flat voice that he had stayed home all evening, listening to the radio with his father, and didn't remember the exact times. Henry asked about the truck. Patterson said he hadn't used it since afternoon because the engine was weak, left it in the yard. Henry requested to look inside the cab. Patterson reluctantly opened the door. The interior was messy, with a few oily rags on the floor. Henry asked when the right headlight had burned out. Patterson replied, just the day before, but couldn't produce a repair receipt. His father, Albert Patterson, came out from inside the house and confirmed that his son had been home. We listened to the sports program together. Henry asked for the exact time. The father said around 8:30 or 9, something like that, then fell silent, looking uncomfortable. Henry scanned the yard and noticed clear tire tracks in the damp soil leading toward the creek. He measured them, recorded the size and tread pattern. They matched the tire photos taken near the creek the day before. Back at the station, he handed the photos to the technical team for comparison and requested confirmation of an exact match. That afternoon, preliminary results from the lab showed the tread pattern, width, and groove spacing were identical. Though further analysis was needed for certainty, Henry underlined the note, "Shape similarity requires further verification." He then reread Mrs. Owen's statement and compared the time she saw the truck with Patterson's claimed timeline at home. The intervals almost overlapped, making Patterson's alibi unreliable. Henry sent 2 officers back to the neighborhood for more interviews. An older man at the old gas station remembered seeing the red Ford pass by that evening, but didn't notice the driver. A teenager walking near the lake reported hearing a truck engine, followed by the sound of a metal door slamming, but when he turned around, he only saw taillights moving away. All these fragments, though scattered, pointed to the truck moving in the area during the exact window Anna disappeared. Henry returned to his office and pulled Patterson's file again. Everything was clean, no criminal record, no traffic violations, no disturbance reports. However, the Eddington Garage personnel evaluation noted, "Works alone, quiet, not friendly." Henry closed the file, looked at the wall map, where the Kloss House, Patterson House, and creek formed a small triangle. He wrote in his notebook, "Suspect vehicle present at scene, independent witness confirmation. Alibi based solely on father's statement, unverifiable. Requires close surveillance." Then he signed the page, Report 6, Witness Statements. Alibi timeline, uncertain. The next morning, Henry received the detailed comparison from the lab, confirming Patterson's tire tread matched the creek prints almost perfectly. He ordered a full search of the Patterson property. 2 patrol cars and 4 officers arrived with cameras, measuring tapes and evidence bags. When the convoy pulled up to the gray house on Maple Lane, Patterson was in the yard, apparently washing his hands after working in the shed. Henry approached, presented the search warrant, and explained it was only to verify statements and clear suspicion. Patterson stood still for a moment, then nodded, clear displeasure on his face. First they examined the red Ford pickup in the yard. They re-measured the tires, compared them to the scene photos, tire size, groove spacing, and wear pattern were identical. An officer photographed every angle and numbered the images. Henry opened the cab. The smell of oil and rust was strong. On the driver's seat lay an oily rag with dried black stains. The floor had clumps of mud. In the truck bed they found tools, 2 oil cans, and a tarp covering half the space. When the tarp was pulled aside, flashlight beams revealed a small piece of green cloth, stuck with engine oil, twisted as if wrung hard. Henry signaled to stop, put on gloves, used tweezers to place the cloth in an evidence bag, marked the time and exact location, and signed on site. An officer added, "Oil type matches samples from Eddington Garage." After finishing with the truck, Henry ordered the shed searched. Inside was a narrow room with an oil-stained concrete floor and walls lined with tools. On the workbench, a grinder, screw boxes, scrap metal pieces. Henry crouched to examine the floor and saw faint wheel tracks, as if something heavy had been dragged. He followed them with his flashlight to a wooden door opening to the backyard. Damp soil outside showed faint continuing tracks toward the woods. An officer measured the width, matched the Ford truck tires. Henry ordered full photographs, then soil samples taken from 2 points, right at the shed door and the end of the drag marks. Inside the house, Henry noted the kitchen was unnaturally tidy. On the dining table, no cups, only a single plate and neatly folded paper napkins. He asked Patterson if anyone had visited that night. The answer was no. Henry turned to Albert Patterson and asked again about the previous evening. The father repeated the same story, dinner together, then radio until bedtime. Henry asked which program. The father couldn't remember. Leaving the room, Henry spotted a pair of brown leather work gloves on a side table by the window, dark stains on the fingers. He asked if they were Patterson's. The man nodded, saying they were for work. Henry ordered the gloves sealed with the note, "Personal item, requires chemical analysis." Back in the yard, he looked at the truck again. An officer was measuring the height of the truck bed edge and distance to the ground. Henry asked why. The officer replied, "Same height as the drag marks on the creek bank." Henry stood silent for a few seconds, then ordered overall photos of the yard and the truck's exit path. Near noon, the search ended. Henry collected all evidence, the green cloth fragment, the gloves, soil samples, and tire measurements. When signing the report, Patterson asked if they needed to take the truck. Henry said it would only be sealed for now, not moved. Patterson stayed quiet, leaning against the doorframe, eyes averted. On the way back to the station, Henry reopened the file and reviewed every line. Times, locations, vehicle type, everything matched the witness accounts. He wrote in his notebook, "Patterson truck matches scene tire tracks. Cloth fragment, oil type matches Eddington Garage. Alibi, still unverified. Continue behavioral data collection." At the station, he handed the evidence to the state forensics lab with priority requests for chemical analysis of the oil and soil comparison between the shed and the creek. Before closing the day's report, Henry stood at the window, looking at quiet Maple Lane, no engine sounds. He underlined the final line, Patterson residence, search complete. Physical evidence consistent, suspect requires tight surveillance. That same afternoon, the evidence collected from the Patterson property was transferred directly to the Connecticut State Police Forensics Lab in Hartford. Henry drove there personally to hand it over, sign the chain of custody forms, and request priority analysis of the oil-stained cloth. The lab was in an older building, but fully equipped for basic chemical analysis. Lead technician Mr. Wallace accepted the sealed bags, checked the numbers, and began extracting the dried oil from the fabric. Using a microscope and ether solvent, he dissolved the residue for component testing. After several hours, the preliminary results showed it was heavy-duty industrial machine oil, commonly used in automotive equipment. Wallace cross-referenced product codes and confirmed it was Eddington Lube 12, the exact brand supplied to the garage where Patterson worked. Henry asked to preserve the sample for direct comparison with oil from the garage. The next day, he and the technician returned to Eddington, took a sealed sample from the main drum, and sent it back to the lab. The comparative test confirmed additives, viscosity, and color were identical. Wallace wrote in the conclusion, "Complete match with product used at Eddington garage. Probability of random coincidence low." Henry underlined that line on his copy. Still, no biological material was found on the cloth. The microscope detected no skin cells, hair, or foreign fibers in the oil. Luminol and fingerprint powder tests were negative. The thick dried oil layer had obscured everything. The summary report stated, "No DNA recovered, no blood, no usable fingerprints." Wallace added that storage conditions and temperature could have destroyed any biological traces if they ever existed. Henry listened quietly, eyes fixed on the enlarged slide of the oil stain. He asked if the cloth's usage time could be estimated. Wallace said only roughly. The oil had been dry for at least 24 hours before collection, which aligned with the night Anna vanished. Henry noted in the margin, dried oil consistent with estimated timeline. He requested full microscope photos, chemical graphs, and signed the final report. Back in Ashford, he submitted the forensic file to the county office. In his summary, Henry wrote, "Evidence recovered from Patterson truck bed contains industrial oil, identical to that used at Eddington garage, suspect's workplace. No biological traces. Physical evidence constitutes indirect linkage." He stamped it, filed the original, and kept a copy in the master case file. That night in his office, Henry reopened his notebook and compared all collected data. The cloth, tire tracks, witness statements, everything formed a logical chain, but still lacked the final link. He underlined the last entry. Evidence supports suspicion, insufficient for charges. Additional behavioral evidence required. The Hartford forensic report arrived in Ashford the next morning. Henry gathered the entire investigative team in the temporary briefing room at the county headquarters. On the table he spread scene photos, tire tread samples, the cloth fragment, and the oil analysis results. He stated briefly that all physical data pointed to one common source, Jacob Patterson's red pickup truck. However, to avoid bias, he asked the team to list every possible scenario. The discussion lasted nearly 2 hours. Every opinion was carefully recorded on the board. One Freer, supporting factors, victim disappeared while walking a short distance, no accident signs, personal item found half a mile away, and the suspect truck seen in the area at the same time, suggesting prior surveillance. Hypothesis 2, accident followed by concealment. Possible collision or fall, perpetrator, then hid the body to avoid responsibility. Henry pointed out there were no blood traces, torn clothing, or impact evidence. Hypothesis 3, victim left voluntarily, perhaps running away or meeting someone. Almost everyone in the room shook their heads. Henry read the parents' statements again. Anna had never skipped school, no family conflicts, no note, no packed belongings, no means of travel, and had never left town alone. Hypothesis 3 was crossed off. After weighing the remaining 2, the team agreed the most likely scenario was premeditated abduction. Henry stood before the wall map, pointing to the area around the Kloss house, and said every trace fell within a half-mile radius, proof the perpetrator knew the terrain intimately. An outsider would hardly choose the exact narrow path from the Kloss house to the creek where the bracelet was found. This shifted focus to locals who knew or had contact with the family. Henry ordered a full list of everyone who had visited the Kloss home in the past 6 months. Electricians, deliverymen, store employees, neighbors, radio repairmen. Patterson's name appeared again. Denise recalled he had fixed their small radio set the previous month. She confirmed he had been polite, stayed only about 15 minutes, and said little. Though not incriminating, it reinforced the prior acquaintance theory. Henry directed the behavioral analysis team to re-examine Patterson's work schedule and movements in the 3 days before the disappearance, interview co-workers, and check any sightings of his truck in the neighborhood. One officer suggested checking area gas stations for fuel purchases that day. Henry approved and added it to the plan. The meeting ended near noon, units dispersed. Henry stayed behind, staring at the map covered in red markers. He knew the physical evidence wasn't strong enough yet, but the connection between Patterson and the Kloss family was becoming clearer. In his notebook, he summarized the 3 hypotheses and crossed out the last 2 lines. Accident, lack of evidence. Voluntary, ruled out. The remaining line he wrote clearly: premeditated abduction, primary investigative direction. Primary subject, known acquaintance, local resident, owns personal vehicle, familiar with terrain. Henry closed the notebook, stood up. Weak sunlight fell through the window onto the stacked case files. He understood that from this moment on, Anna Kloss's disappearance was no longer the story of a lost child, but a carefully calculated crime committed by someone living right in the heart of Ashford. Following the hypothesis meeting, Henry continued examining factors supporting premeditated abduction. In the 56-page investigative report he had just drafted, one detail stood out. Most recent rural break-ins in the area involved hunting shotguns, especially the common 12-gauge in Windham County. To rule out firearm use in this case, Henry asked administration to cross-reference registered firearm owners in the area. A thick file arrived from the county courthouse, listing over 150 valid permit holders, farmers, hunters, security personnel, sporting goods store owners. He divided the team to filter those living within 5 miles of the Kloss house. The result: 21 names, 5 of them on Maple Lane. When compared to the suspect resident file, Jacob Patterson's name appeared for the 3rd time in the investigation. Once in the vehicle list, once among known acquaintances, and now as the registered owner of a 12-gauge shotgun. Henry opened the permit. Issued 2 years earlier, Mossberg brand, serial number clear, stated purpose: bird hunting and sporting target shooting. He underlined legal, then requested verification of recent inspection. A staff member reported that Eddington Garage had once stored Patterson's shotgun in the personal locker because he lived with his father and had no gun safe at home. Henry requested a formal check of the weapon's condition and remaining ammunition. However, when the search warrant application reached the county court, it was returned with the note: no direct evidence linking the firearm to the disappearance. Warrant denied. Henry read the line and fell silent for a long time. He understood that legal procedure in those days was strict, without signs of firearm use or violence. A second home search would be considered overreach. Still, he decided to continue checking the remaining gun owners to avoid oversight. Over the next 3 days, the team made random visits to the other registered owners. Most cooperated, showed permits and weapons. No one else raised suspicion. The weekly report to State Police Headquarters stated no indication firearms were used in the case area. Though the result seemed meaningless, Henry treated it as part of the overall picture. Patterson had the vehicle. An unverified time gap, indirect ties to the Kloss family, and now legal ownership of a weapon. He wrote in his notebook: 12-gauge shotgun legally registered. Inspection warrant denied. Continue monitoring usage status. After finishing the cross-check, Henry returned to the map and added a small circle symbol next to Patterson's name, his personal code for firearm owner in suspect zone. On his desk, the case files were stacked high, each page marked with a tiny red dot. He looked at them, sighed, and realized that although every trail led to one person, he still lacked the single piece of evidence needed to take the next decisive step. After the firearm owner list was fully reviewed, Henry returned to the crime scene intending to conduct a second, expanded search focused on the Lake Ashford area, an area the original night patrol team had only superficially checked. He chose early morning, when the water level was still low and the light strong enough to clearly see the ground. The search team consisted of 13 people, 5 state troopers, and 8 local volunteers. They carried metal detectors, measuring tapes, and white cloth evidence bags. Henry pointed on the map, defining the search zone starting from the eastern shore, extending along the forest edge, and ending at the small creek where Anna's bracelet had been found. The sky was gray, clouds low, the air damp and cold. Teams moved slowly, spaced dozens of yards apart, shining flashlights on the wet ground. The rustle of dry leaves mixed with the wind across the lake. A little over an hour later, Trooper Miller called out after spotting something caught in the reeds near the water's edge. Henry approached and bent down to see a dark green piece of fabric protruding from the mud. Wearing gloves, he gently pulled. The mud gave way, revealing a thick jacket with rusted brass buttons, one collar torn and the left sleeve covered in black mud. Henry opened an evidence bag, carefully placed the jacket inside, then closely examined the shoulders and sleeves. Dark oil stains and a distinct metallic smell. He ordered scene photos, measurements from the water's edge to the find, and wooden stakes to mark the spot. In the mud there were several overlapping shoe prints, but dating them was impossible due to changing water levels. Henry directed soil samples around the jacket, water samples, and 3 nearby plant samples for comparative analysis. When the jacket was lifted, a female team member recognized the color as similar to the sweater Anna wore the night she vanished. Henry made no comment, only writing in the report, "Green jacket discovered on east shore of Lake Ashford, bearing machine oil stains, suspected to belong to victim." After sealing, he stepped back and stared at the calm water. A few ducks dove far offshore, leaving small ripples. He knew that after days of nothing, this was the first item with potential direct connection to the girl. On the way back, the team carried the evidence in a metal case and handed it to the on-site forensics unit. In the handwritten preliminary report, Henry noted every detail: weather, temperature, mud depth, and the characteristic oil smell. He added one more line: oil residue still tacky, not fully washed away, likely adhered close to time of disappearance. The jacket was taken to storage, placed on a stainless steel tray, and photographed under white light. Henry requested it be labeled with the same case number as the cloth fragment recovered from Patterson's truck bed for future comparison. The search continued until afternoon, but yielded nothing else noteworthy. When light rain began, he called the teams in. On the drive back to headquarters, Henry opened his notebook and added a few lines to the summary. Lake Ashford area, female green jacket recovered, machine oil smell consistent. No sharp tear damage, soil samples preserved. Evidence officially logged. He paused, writing, looked out the car window where raindrops streaked and reflected the dim streetlights. On the seat beside him, the box containing the jacket was securely strapped, lying silently, as if holding the last remaining piece of a little girl who had vanished one cold night in the town of Ashford. The jacket examination report arrived 3 days later, confirming the oil stains were the same industrial machine oil as the sample from Eddington's garage, but no additional biological traces or usable DNA were found. The result left Henry at an impasse. In his small office at county headquarters, he stared at the evidence board, covered with notes where Jacob Patterson's name repeated across every column, yet every arrow connecting them ended with the words, insufficient grounds. Additional interviews with Patterson and his father yielded nothing new. They stuck to the same story, home all evening listening to the radio, never went out. Witness Mildred Owen was certain she saw the red truck, but couldn't positively identify the driver due to poor light. Forensics found no direct match between Patterson and the evidence, and the gun search warrant had been denied. All the evidence, though circumstantially linked, fell short of the legal threshold for charges. Henry met with the county prosecutor, presented the full investigation results, but received only a headshake. "We cannot go to trial without solid proof." The official report read, "Insufficient grounds for prosecution. Investigation suspended." On May 17, 1958, Henry signed the final page of case file, CL 1456A, then turned over all evidence, maps, photographs, statements, and comparison samples to the State Archive in Hartford. Before sealing the box, he looked once more at the photo of the green jacket and his own handwritten note, "Suspected abduction, unresolved." He placed the photo inside, closed the lid, and sealed it with the red Ashford Police Department stamp. A week later, word spread that Jacob Patterson had left town, telling neighbors he was going to Boston for work. The gray house on Maple Lane stood shuttered, grass growing high in the yard, windows dusty. James and Denise Kloss continued living in their old house. Their daughter's bedroom window was covered by white curtains. Henry occasionally drove past that road, stopped the car, and looked toward the woods behind where crows still perched in the trees, everything silent, as if nothing had ever happened. In his duty log, the final entry for the case was written in black ink. Investigation suspended, no further leads. File archived in Hartford, CL 1456. Closing the notebook, Henry told himself that one day, if technology advanced enough, someone might open this envelope and see what he could not see on that bleak morning when the town of Ashford remained sunk in the long silence following an unsolved disappearance. Case file, CL 1456A, was transferred to Hartford in early summer 1958. Packed in 2 wooden crates, stamped red Temporary Archive. Henry Lamb personally signed the handover form, then watched the transport staff carry them into the Connecticut State Police storage warehouse. The room held thousands of other files stacked nearly to the ceiling under dim fluorescent lights. The clerk logged code, CL 1456A, categorized it, missing person, unresolved, and placed Henry's file between 2 old cases from 1949 and 1953. Each box received a tag with the date, responsible officer, and a note in blue ink. Reporting Officer Henry Lamb, Ashford Police Department. After the paperwork was complete, the crates were moved deep into Zone A3, where unresolved cases from the past decade were kept. Henry signed off, paused for a moment, in the cold room, where only the hum of ventilation fans and the rustle of paper could be heard. He knew that under the current circumstances, Anna Kloss's case would lie dormant here, like hundreds of other forgotten stories. When he returned to Ashford, summer had begun, the forest around the lake was green again, and the town resumed its old rhythm. Local newspapers stopped mentioning the case. Headlines about Ashford girls still missing were gradually replaced by crop reports and fall festival news. For the next 2 years, there were no further reports of new leads. A few volunteers who had helped search still occasionally visited the Klosses, but their lives also quietly closed around the silence. Henry continued his routine work at the station, handling petty thefts, traffic accidents, and every now and then opened his old notebook to reread his own fading handwriting. He no longer mentioned Patterson or sent additional investigative requests, knowing there was no legal basis to reopen the case. In the early 1960s, the State Archive was upgraded into Connecticut's first official cold case system. All unresolved files were moved to new basement storage in the Hartford Administrative Building. Crate CL 1456A was among them, resealed in fresh oil paper and placed on metal shelf 3 row H12, alongside 64 other cases. The file was recoded and labeled Cold Case, Missing Person 1956 Ashford. In the warehouse's first electronic register, the entry was brief: unresolved disappearance, indefinite storage. Years passed, thick dust slowly covered the crates. Henry Lamb's name remained on the responsible officer list, but no one asked about it anymore. When he retired in 1971, an internal memo noted, "No new investigative activity since May 17, 1958. File CL 1456A officially became part of the state's cold case collection. One file lying silent among thousands of forgotten cases, waiting for someone with enough reason and patience to reopen it after more than half a century." In early 2011, in the new administrative complex of the Connecticut State Police in Hartford, the Cold Case Review Unit was re-established with the mission of reviewing all unresolved 20th century cases. The first batch consisted of over 200 files transferred from basement storage, each wooden crate bearing a red seal. Among them, Lydia Freeman, a 32-year-old detective, was assigned to examine missing person cases from eastern Connecticut in the 1950s. While scanning the summary list, one file caught her attention, code CL 1456A, titled Missing Person, Ashford, 1956. Original investigator, Henry Lamb. The name made Lydia pause. Henry Lamb was her grandfather, who had served as Ashford police chief for nearly 30 years. The family rarely spoke of his career, only mentioning that he had carried one unsolved case in his heart until retirement. Lydia requested permission from her superior to open this file. When the crate was pulled from the shelf, thick dust coated her hands. The red wax seal was intact. The handwriting, H. Lamb, 1958, was faded but legible. She gently lifted the lid. The smell of old paper and long-sealed dampness rose, feeling like touching the past. Inside were thick stacks of documents, faded Ashford maps, black and white photos, brown ink reports, and an oilcloth evidence pouch containing the green cloth fragment, a short piece of cord, and a note in her grandfather's handwriting. Oil matches Eddington type. Insufficient evidence. Lydia read every line, lingering longest on the conclusion. File archived Hartford. She sat silent for several minutes, then began copying the data into the new system. That night, in her quiet office, Lydia reread the entire file. The scene details, Henry's meticulous notes and reasoning, remained clear and precise, despite being written over half a century ago. She realized the limitations of that era, lack of forensic technology, no DNA analysis, were exactly why the case had stalled. She decided to try reopening it with modern methods. The next day, Lydia formally presented her proposal to Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes, head of the Cold Case Review Unit. She explained that the case had fully sealed, well-preserved physical evidence with high potential for residual biological material. Hayes read the proposal, looked at her for a few seconds, then signed approval with the note, authorized for DNA testing and full physical reanalysis of all evidence. Objective, identify material source and cross-reference state databases. Lydia gave a small smile, part professional, part deeply personal. That same afternoon, she transferred all evidence bags to the Central Forensic Laboratory in Hartford. The unsealing process was conducted under supervision of 2 technicians and video recording. When the wax was removed, the green fabric fragment was darker and brittle, but still showed oil stains in places. The green jacket, stored separately in the second bag, retained its collar shape. A few fine hairs clung to the inner lining. Technicians photographed, measured, then extracted potential biological samples for testing. Under the microscope, they located tiny epidermal cells at the edge of the oil stain suitable for DNA extraction. Lydia requested duplicate samples, one sent to the state DNA lab, one retained in central storage. She also ordered chemical reanalysis of the machine oil, cross-referenced against 1950s industrial product data to confirm manufacturing origin. The re-examination was officially logged under new code TL 1456, A2011. When procedures were complete, Lydia stood looking at the evidence tray, her fingers lightly brushing the page bearing Henry Lamb's signature. Beside her, the wall clock ticked steadily, its sound echoing like a bridge between 2 eras of investigation. She knew this was no longer just a job. It was the last chance to close a case that had haunted her grandfather for the rest of his life. That night, Lydia wrote the first entry in the internal log. March 12, 2011. Seas Pulse 1456, a reactivated under Cold Case Review Unit Authority. Evidence intact, currently undergoing DNA testing. Immediate objective, identify oil, fabric, and biological traces. In the corner of the report she signed, Inspector Lydia Freeman, next to the small note personal relation to original investigator, Henry Lamb. When she turned off the lights and left the office, the administrative corridor was silent. Only security lights reflecting on the polished floor. In the air lingered the scent of old paper and sealing wax, as if time had just been pulled backward, allowing the 1956 Ashford disappearance to step out of half a century of dust and return to the desk of an inspector who shared blood with the man who had first opened that file more than 50 years earlier. 2 months after Lydia submitted the re-examination request, the official results from the Connecticut State Forensic Laboratory arrived at the Cold Case Review Unit in a sealed brown envelope bearing the red stamp of the Central Investigative Agency. Lydia opened it with a letter opener, her hand trembling slightly as she read the first headline, DNA Analysis Report. Case CL 1456, a 2011. The smell of fresh paper mixed with printer ink reminded her of the old files her grandfather had kept. Except now the past could be measured in numbers and probabilities. The first page presented results from hair samples taken from the jacket collar. Genetic sequence matches Kloss family DNA profile in the Connecticut State Database. 99.984% probability. That short absolute conclusion took Lydia's breath away. The jacket found at Lake Ashford was indeed Anna Kloss's. She turned the page. The second report addressed epidermal cells recovered from the oil-stained green fabric fragment. Partial genetic sequence matches Patterson family DNA profile. Similarity 98.6%, confirming high likelihood of shared lineage. The bolded word Patterson made Lydia freeze. Her eyes locked on the footnote below. Probability of random population match in the region, 0.001%. She took a deep breath and carefully highlighted each result in red. 2 pieces of evidence, 2 DNA sources, and both pointed to the same unfinished picture Henry Lamb had once sketched. A missing girl, a man who lived nearby, and an invisible thread connecting them through physical traces that had survived half a century. In the chemical analysis section, the technician detailed oil composition on both items consistent with Eddington Lube 12, industrial machine oil manufactured at the Eddington plant, New Haven, 1955-1957. Under microscopy, additives, viscosity, and oxidation markers all matched archived industrial standards. This proved the oil on the jacket and the fabric fragment came from the same source, the exact type Patterson used daily at the garage. Lydia reread the section, then quickly noted in her log. Evidence shows direct chemical link to suspect's workplace. The final page bore the signature of lead technician Wallace, who had worked in forensics for over 30 years. He concluded, physical evidence confirms contact between items and the Eddington garage industrial environment. No cross-contamination during storage. Results reliable. Lydia sat motionless in her office, watching light reflect off the stainless steel table. Everything had fallen into place. She photographed every page and created a comparison table. Column 1, 1956 evidence. Column 2, 2011, analysis data. Final column, conclusion. Everything matched. That same afternoon, Lydia presented the full results to Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes in a special cold case review unit meeting. The room was dead silent as she displayed the first slide, the black and white photo of the oil-stained jacket, followed by enlarged DNA sequences on the digital screen. She spoke concisely, every detail backed by charts, without a single unnecessary pause. At the conclusion, Lydia stated clearly, Evidence establishes direct connection between victim Anna Kloss and suspect Jacob Patterson. Legal grounds sufficient to request criminal reinvestigation. Hayes leaned back, silent for several seconds, then asked, "Chain of custody on the evidence remains intact." Lydia produced the 1958 document signed by Henry Lamb. All storage, sealing, and transfer confirmations. Everything was unbroken. Hayes nodded and wrote a few lines in the meeting minutes. Sufficient grounds to reopen file CL 1456A. Recommend approval for supplemental criminal investigation. That afternoon, the Connecticut Attorney General's office signed the official order. The first line read, "Based on DNA physical and chemical analysis results, case CL 1456A, 1956 Ashford disappearance, is determined to contain criminal elements. Order to reopen investigation approved May 4, 2011. Lydia held the red-stamped copy, feeling as if a 60-year circle had finally closed. She wrote in her duty log, "Jacket DNA matches Kloss family. Fabric DNA matches Patterson family. Oil matches 1950s industrial sample. Reopening order approved." As she closed the file, Lydia gently placed her hand on Henry Lamb's faded signature on the old cover, a belated answer to the man who had started this investigation. 1 week after the order to reopen the investigation was approved, Lydia Freeman left Hartford on an early morning drive, back to the town of Ashford, where her grandfather, Henry Lamb, had spent nearly his entire police career. The road cutting through the spring maple forests was still narrow, bordered by a thin morning mist. 60 years had passed, but as the car turned onto the main street, the town appeared almost unchanged. Low wooden houses, small porches, the faded Ashford General Store sign hanging crooked, and the old church still standing silently in the square. Lydia stopped in front of what had once been the Kloss family home, now owned by someone else. The new owner, Mrs. Eleanor Burns, a woman in her 70s, greeted her with a cautious but cooperative smile when Lydia explained the purpose of her visit. The house retained its original structure, 2-story oak, dark brown shingled roof, small front yard, and a peeling white fence. In the kitchen, Lydia immediately recognized the spot Henry had marked on the 1956 crime scene diagram as point where victim left the house. The back door opened onto a small stone-paved patio that connected to the dirt path leading toward the woods. She walked around, recording notes on a handheld voice recorder and photographing every angle. The living room was virtually unchanged, windows facing the field, red brick fireplace, and the narrow wooden staircase to the second floor. Everything carried an eerie stillness. Lydia felt as if she were stepping back into the old timeline, where every object still held the memory of the evening in 1956, when Anna Kloss walked out of this place and never returned. After finishing the survey, she thanked Mrs. Burns and drove northwest through town to the Patterson house, which still stood, though abandoned for years. Maple Lane was deserted, overgrown with weeds on both sides. The gray-painted house was faded, windows boarded up, corrugated iron roof rusted, and a wooden sign reading Patterson and Son, repairs swaying in the wind. Lydia and 2 technicians used lock-picking tools to push open the heavy iron door, which creaked loudly. A strong smell of damp, grease, and rust hit them. Inside, it was dim, thick dust covering the remaining furniture, a wooden table, tool shelves, glass jars of nails and screws, and scattered old newspapers on the floor. Lydia turned on her flashlight and moved slowly through the rooms. The main house was nearly empty. Only an old dining table and a broken-legged chair remained. At the end of the hallway was the door to the shed, the place Henry had noted in his report, dragged marks from heavy object toward back garden. She pushed it open. Long beams of light from roof cracks fell across the cracked concrete floor. The surface was mottled, old oil stains still visible. When she shone her light on the north corner wall, Lydia stopped. A crack ran nearly 5 feet diagonally from the wall to the center of the floor, the concrete around it darker and inconsistent with the rest. She knelt, tapped lightly with a knife. The sound was unusually hollow, The technician beside her measured depth and found this section of concrete nearly 2 inches thicker than the original pour. "This floor was redone," Lydia said quietly, then ordered full photographs of the area, coordinate numbering, and notes added to the diagram. She looked around further. Every other part of the floor was covered in thick dust, but this section appeared cleaner, with faint old scrubbing marks. On the wall she noticed 3 small drilled holes, possibly once for tool shelves, now crudely filled. Lydia opened Henry's old map, compared it, and realized the crack lay exactly where he had marked, signs of heavy object movement. A chill ran down her spine. 60 years earlier, Henry had probably stood in this very spot, looking down at the floor and writing that note in his log. Now Lydia was staring at the same crack, only covered by a newer layer of concrete. She stood silently for a moment, listening to the wind whistling through the roof gaps, then instructed the team to take additional moisture, temperature, and crack depth readings for the structural report. Leaving the shed, Lydia paused on the back porch, gazing out at the overgrown yard, and farther off, the maple forest stretching to the shores of Lake Ashford. The scene was so peaceful, it was hard to believe this had once been the center of a massive search half a century ago. She pulled out her notebook and wrote quickly, "Old crime scene survey, Kloss House, original structure intact, no renovations. Patterson House, large crack in concrete floor, signs of patching and replacement material. Suspect area matches exact location on 1956 map. Recommend sealing and deep examination of floor slab." She closed the notebook, looked down misty Maple Lane, and thought that if her grandfather were still alive, he would instantly understand what she had just found. The late afternoon sky over Ashford was a silvery gray light falling across the old rooftops, and Lydia knew that for the first time in 60 years, a real sign had appeared in the heart of a town that seemed to have fallen asleep inside its memories. Early on the third morning after the survey report was submitted, the Connecticut Attorney General's office signed the official excavation warrant for the Patterson property. Lydia Freeman personally commanded the crime scene team, joined by the state forensics unit and 2 specialists in archaeological recovery. When they arrived in Ashford, low clouds hung heavy, the air thick around the gray house. The Patterson property was fully sealed off, temporary fencing erected around the yard, crime scene, do not enter, signs hanging crookedly on the porch. From the outside the house looked desolate, windows shuttered, rust dripping from the tin roof. But Lydia knew the crucial part lay inside, beneath the cracked concrete floor she had discovered days earlier. Work began at 8 a.m. Technicians used diamond blade saws to cut the floor into sections, numbering and filming each piece. Every time the blade hit concrete, a shrill metallic screech echoed through the small room. Henry Lamb had once written in an old note that this house may contain a second layer of flooring, and now Lydia was standing exactly where he had suspected. When the top layer of concrete was removed, the underlying surface appeared darker and unusually damp. Forensic technicians measured soil compression and found abnormal density, evidence that something heavy had once pressed down. The lead forensic officer ordered hand tools to avoid damage. Everyone changed to fresh gloves and worked slowly with small trowels and soft brushes. Less than an hour later, the tip of one technician's trowel struck something hard with a faint clink. They stopped, gently brushed away dirt, and revealed a small round metal ring glinting through the mud. Lydia leaned in, her flashlight reflected faint engraving inside, AC. She didn't need to check the file to know what it was. The silver bracelet listed in Henry Lamb's report over half a century ago, the one Denise Kloss had confirmed, was her daughter's birthday gift. Lydia wrote in her log and signed next to the entry, Evidence Item #1, silver bracelet engraved AC, recovered at 0.4 m below floor surface. The forensics team dug another half-meter deeper. The soil began mixing with small brittle bone fragments, grayish-brown. The technicians visually identified them as human, likely from a juvenile. No one spoke. Movement slowed to only the soft scrape of trowels on dirt. Each bone fragment was marked with a small plastic tag, photographed, then placed in individual foil-lined boxes for DNA preservation. Lydia watched from behind, an indescribable mix of shock and sorrow washing over her. 10 minutes later, in the western corner of the pit, another object emerged, a rectangular tin box covered in green rust. When lifted, the lid popped open to reveal a broken eyeglass frame and thin fabric lining the bottom. Engraved on the lid, Optic Company Boston, exactly matching the description of the glasses case Anna Kloss carried to school. Lydia added to her log, evidence item #2, tin glasses case. Recovered from same soil layer as bones and bracelet. Work continued until nearly noon. The entire shed floor was removed in a large 3x3 meter grid. From the remaining soil, the team recovered additional scattered bone fragments, 38 in total, including a small portion of skull and an incisor tooth. Everything was sealed, coded CL 1456AX17, and transported the same day to the Hartford Forensic Lab in a refrigerated van. Lydia rode in the convoy, carrying copies of the scene report and all photographs. On the way, she opened Henry's old notebook and reread the line he had written. "If the truth lies beneath our feet, time will find a way to reveal it." 3 weeks later, the State Forensic Lab released the official results. The report opened with the sentence, "DNA analysis of bone samples recovered from Patterson residence matches Kloss family genetic profile at 99.98%. The sequence was cross-referenced with a sample from Anna Kloss's living cousin in Rhode Island, confirming direct lineage. Carbon isotope testing also placed bone age at approximately 13 years at time of death, consistent with the missing person file. In the conclusion section, lead technician Wallace signed and noted, "Victim identity Anna Kloss, born 1943, disappeared Ashford 1956. Physical evidence consistent with intentional burial, not natural causes." Lydia read that line and paused for a long time. She set the report beside the photographs of the bracelet and glasses case, items that had once been only theories in Henry Lamb's file, now undeniable reality. In her own investigative log, she wrote briefly, July 8, 2011. Forensic team successfully excavated Patterson residence floor, recovered juvenile, human remains. AC engraved bracelet, tin glasses case. DNA results confirm victim Anna Kloss. Then she closed the notebook, looked out the window at the late afternoon sun falling across Ashford's wooden rooftops, and felt that her grandfather's case had finally found its voice, not from the living, but from evidence that had risen after more than half a century, buried beneath cold concrete. Once the DNA results confirmed that the remains under the Patterson house were Anna Kloss, Lydia Freeman officially opened the suspect tracing phase. She began by searching all Connecticut population records and administrative databases, cross-referencing the 1958 note from Henry Lamb's file, left Ashford for work in Boston. That was the only remaining lid. Lydia sent requests to the Social Security Administration, Department of Homeland Security, and the Federal Residency System for any trace of Jacob L. Patterson, born 1934, Ashford native, occupation mechanic. 3 days later, the first response arrived. A matching individual had applied for unemployment benefits in Boston in 1960, changed address to Hartford, Connecticut in 1972. The last record listed, resident at Hartford Elder Care Facility, receiving retirement benefits. Lydia immediately verified through internal police channels. Once confirmed, she and 2 cold case review unit officers drove to the nursing home on Monday morning. The building sat in a quiet suburb surrounded by old maples, a small sign reading, Hartford Elder Care at the entrance. The facility director, Mrs. Collins, met them in her office and confirmed that a Jacob Patterson lived on the second floor, room 204. According to her, Mr. Patterson had moved in during 2008, spoke little, was in frail health, but mentally alert, and had no family visitors. To avoid alerting the investigation, Lydia chose indirect DNA collection. Mrs. Collins agreed to cooperate and escorted a technician into Patterson's room under the pretense of a hygiene inspection. When the door opened, Lydia observed from the hallway, the room was small and tidy. An armchair, a wooden cabinet on the table, a water glass, toothbrush, handkerchief, and a few personal items. The technician carefully bagged everything, labeling the envelope, CL 1456, AJP, 2011. Patterson sat leaning back in the chair, staring out the window, seemingly unaware of their presence. Lydia caught a glimpse of the face, aged, silent, eyes cloudy behind thick glasses, and thought of the black and white photo in the old file of the 21-year-old man standing in front of the garage. When the items reached the Hartford Forensic Lab, Lydia attached an urgent request to compare the DNA with the 1956 oil-stained green fabric sample. 3 days later, the results arrived. On the white sheet, the bold conclusion read, DNA sequence from Jacob L. Patterson indirect sample matches 99.72% with evidence item CL 1456, A 1956. Below the note, reliability of individual identification near absolute. Lydia read it over and over, gripping the report so tightly the edges crumpled. She forwarded the entire file to Lieutenant Colonel Hayes with a request for an emergency arrest warrant. An internal cold case review unit meeting was called that same afternoon. On the screen, Lydia presented every step of the trace, Social Security records, state archive cross-checks, residency verification, DNA collection, and the matching results. She spoke concisely, each piece of evidence backed by forensic documents, scene photos, and chain of custody logs. No one in the room spoke as Lydia displayed the enlarged lab report. Left side, the 1956 DNA sequence, right side, the sequence from Patterson's toothbrush. The two graphs overlaid almost perfectly. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes reviewed everything, nodded, signed the prosecution recommendation, and forwarded the file to the state prosecutor's office. Connecticut Chief Prosecutor Samuel Reed received the case and immediately prepared the arrest warrant application. Based on the scientific evidence, historical statements, and physical evidence from the scene, he concluded there were sufficient legal grounds to charge first-degree murder. Late afternoon on July 21, 2011, a Hartford District Court judge signed the warrant, affixing the red state seal. The first line read, Jacob L. Patterson, born 1934, resident Hartford Elder Care Facility, official suspect in case CL 1456A. Lydia held the stamped copy, a cold, heavy feeling in her chest. She wrote in her duty log, Jacob L. Patterson, age 77. Identified. Indirect DNA sample, complete match with evidence, CL 1456A, 1956. Arrest warrant lawfully approved by Hartford Court. 60 years after the original case closed, the prime suspect has been officially located. She set down her pen, looked out the office window at the sunset falling over Hartford's rooftops, the fading red light reflecting off the warrant in her hand, as if time had finally closed its circle and returned the name Patterson to the exact place it had always belonged in the Lamb family's investigative history. On the morning of July 22, 2011, as Hartford woke to sunlight, 4 cold case review unit officers and a state SWAT team arrived at Hartford Elder Care to execute the arrest warrant for Jacob L. Patterson. Lydia Freeman was present from early on, watching silently from outside. The procedure was carried out quietly and by the book. Director Collins was briefly informed and agreed to cooperate. When the officers entered room 204, Patterson was sitting in his armchair by the window, reading the morning paper. He looked up, cloudy eyes behind thick glasses. The lead officer read the warrant aloud, calm but firm. Patterson offered no resistance, only asked softly, for what happened in Ashford, right? Then he nodded and held out his wrists as the cold metal cuffs closed. Outside, Lydia stood motionless, watching the scene, unable to read whether the old man's eyes held fear, regret, or emptiness. He was placed in the patrol car and transported to State Police Headquarters in Hartford, for interrogation. The interview began at 10 a.m. He attended by Prosecutor Samuel Reed, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, and Inspector Lydia. Patterson was offered a public defender, but declined, saying he only wanted to tell everything before it's too late. The interview room was small, harsh white light, shining on the metal table, 2 audio recorders in the corners. Lydia sat across from him, opened Henry Lamb's old file, and placed on the table the photograph of the AC engraved bracelet. Patterson stared at it for a long time, then sighed, voice hoarse. "I thought it would never be found." That first sentence opened a confession that lasted over 6 hours. He said that in 1956, he was a young mechanic at Eddington's garage, often driving through North Ashford, making deliveries. He first saw Anna Kloss when she and her mother shopped at the nearby store. "She was a good kid, polite, and I don't know why her face stayed with me," Patterson said slowly, evenly, eyes fixed on nothing. After that he began passing the Kloss house repeatedly, pretending to check his engine or stopping to fix a neighbor's pump. During that time he watched the family's routines, meal times, bedtime, and the evenings Anna played in the backyard with the dog. On the night of October 14, 1956, Patterson carried his legal 12-gauge shotgun, a flashlight, and a small knife, walking from his house to Ashford Lane. He waited nearly 2 hours in the Kloss's backyard, then saw the kitchen door open. When James Kloss stepped out to check a noise, Patterson fired once at close range, killing him instantly. Denise Kloss panicked, pulled her daughter into the bathroom, locked the door, and tried to call police. Patterson broke in and fired again. "It all happened so fast," he said, hands trembling slightly. "I don't know why I did it." He then dragged the mother's body out, tied Anna's hands with rope, gagged her, and put her in the truck bed. He drove straight home. The roads were empty in the night. The girl regained consciousness on the way and struggled, but Patterson did not stop. Once home, he took her to the basement, tied her to a post, blindfolded her, and locked her in the back shed, the same place Lydia later discovered under concrete. "I thought I'd just keep her a while and let her go," he whispered. "But then I got scared people would find out." For the first weeks Patterson brought her food and water, let her sleep on an old blanket. But as news of the disappearance spread and police began searching the area, he panicked and stopped going out. "I heard the loudspeakers calling her name every night. I couldn't take it," he said, voice breaking. When Lydia asked what finally happened to Anna, Patterson was silent for a long time, then answered in a dry rasp, "She got weak. One day I opened the door, and she didn't get up anymore. I don't know if it was sickness or fear. I buried her under the floor, in the north corner, and poured concrete over it. I thought no one would ever find her." Lydia asked why he kept the bracelet. Patterson said he found it on the shed floor after the burial, and for reasons he couldn't explain, kept it as a reminder. Patterson's confession matched Henry Lamb's 1956 notes almost perfectly. Direction of movement, tire track locations, machine oil smell, fresh concrete patch, and the AC bracelet Henry had found in the creek, which Lydia now realized Patterson may have thrown there as a second bracelet to mislead the investigation. When asked if anyone else was involved, Patterson shook his head. "No, I did it alone. My father never knew." He said that after police questioned him the first time, he decided to leave Ashford to avoid suspicion, drifted to various places, and eventually returned to Hartford, working in garages until retirement. "I grew old, but every night I saw her in my dreams," he said, almost whispering. "I never escaped it." Lydia took careful notes, every detail aligned with Henry's original file. 2 gunshots, back door, left open. Police arrival within 4 minutes, tire tracks leaving Maple Lane, and the machine oil smell around the area. When the interview ended, Patterson signed the statement, hand shaking but handwriting still clear. Before being led away, he looked at Lydia and asked quietly, "Henry Lamb, is he still alive?" She answered softly, "No, he passed in 1971. Patterson lowered his head and said nothing more. Lydia watched as officers escorted him out. Harsh hallway light fell on his white hair, his shadow stretching long across the tile floor. In the air remained only the soft rustle of turning pages and the click of the recorders stopping, closing an interrogation that 60 years earlier, Henry Lamb had hoped to conduct, an interrogation that now matched every detail of the 1956 case file he had left behind. After the interrogation session ended, Lydia Freeman left the interview room both exhausted and tense. In her hand was the nearly 40-page statement transcript, in which Patterson had described in detail the entire sequence of events on the night of October 14, 1956. The night Anna Claus's disappearance began. That same afternoon, Lydia brought the full statement to the Cold Case Archive, where Henry Lamb's original files were still preserved in Vault A3. She requested access to the physical files for cross-verification. On the table, 2 case folders lay side by side, one labeled CL 1456 AD, 1956. Henry Lamb Report, the other interrogation transcript of Jacob L. Patterson, 2011. She opened both at the same time, using a red pen to mark matching points. In Henry's report, the very first line read, "Rear door of Claus residence unlocked, unfamiliar boot prints leading toward the woods, tire tracks stopping approximately 50 yards from the house." In Patterson's statement, he said, "I parked about 50 yards from the house, back by the woods, because I didn't want anyone to see." A perfect match. Lydia continued, comparing section by section. Henry noted, industrial machine oil odor detected around the scene. Drag marks extending to Maple Road. Patterson confessed, "I stepped in oil leaving the shop. I might have left traces." Henry wrote, 12-gauge shotgun casing found beside kitchen door, matching the type registered to Patterson. Patterson confirmed, "I used the Mossberg 12-gauge. I never threw it away, just buried it in the woods out back." She circled these 2 lines in red. They were virtually identical in detail. Every small note Henry made, every hypothesis, was now proven completely correct. In the behavioral description, Henry wrote, "Perpetrator, most likely entered through the kitchen, fired unexpectedly, targeting the victim's parents." Patterson recounted the exact same sequence, including the moment he kicked in the bathroom door, where Anna and her mother were hiding. Henry had predicted the perpetrator had mechanical experience and was familiar with firearms and trucks, which also matched Patterson's occupation. When Lydia turned to the final pages of the old report, she came across a handwritten line by Henry. Hypothesis: victim may have been held in an area near the suspect's residence. Cannot rule out the possibility that the perpetrator poured concrete to conceal. That sentence stopped Lydia cold. It had practically predicted exactly what they discovered 60 years later: the fresh concrete patch, the cracks, and the remains beneath the floor. In the recorded interrogation, Patterson had also stated precisely, "I buried the girl in the north corner of the wall, then poured concrete and smoothed it myself." Not a single inch of deviation from the diagram Henry had once drawn. Lydia added one final check mark, then sat silently at the table, staring at the 2 stacks of documents. Between the yellowed pages of 1956 and the crisp printouts of 2011, there was no gap except time itself. Every fact, from timing to actions, from physical evidence to scene characteristics, matched perfectly, to the point that it gave her chills when she thought about Henry Lamb's accuracy. He had seen everything, only missing one piece of technology his era didn't yet have. Lydia prepared the official comparison report and wrote the opening line, "Cross-verification between suspect Jacob L. Patterson's statement and Henry Lamb's original 1956 investigation report yields absolute concurrence in timeline, location, means, sequence of actions, and scene description." She listed the details under 5 headings: 1 parking location, 2 vehicle and type of machine oil, 3 firearm type and number of shots fired, 4 method of entry and body transport, 5 concealment location. Each heading had 2 columns for comparison and a more for perfect match. At the bottom of the page, Lydia added by hand, "Henry Lamb, 1956 report. Absolutely accurate, never disproven. When finished, she forwarded the summary to the state prosecutor's office with a request to attach it to the official indictment file. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes read the comparison and simply said, "Your grandfather was right." Lydia gave a faint smile, feeling in that moment as if 2 generations of investigators had closed the same case together. The one who wrote the questions and the one who finally received the answers. In her duty log, she wrote, "Comparison complete." Patterson's 2011 statement confirms the absolute accuracy of Henry Lamb's 1956 report. 6 decades of investigation are now linked by evidence with no factual discrepancies. Then she closed the logbook, placed the 2 case folders side by side, one old, one new, and on both covers the same words appeared, CL 1456A, Ashford case. After completing the file comparison and confirming the absolute accuracy between Patterson's statement and the 1956 report, Lydia Freeman and the state forensic team moved to the crime scene reconstruction phase. The goal was to recreate the entire sequence of the crime based on the confession, physical evidence, and real-world spatial data to clearly visualize how the perpetrator moved, committed the act, and held the victim. The reconstruction was conducted at the Connecticut State Criminal Analysis Center using 3D simulation technology and laser scan data from the Kloss House, the Ashford Woods, Maple Road, and the Patterson property. First, the team built a 1956-era terrain model based on archived maps, crime scene photos, and Henry Lamb's records to establish Patterson's route from the Eddington shop back to Ashford, turning onto Maple Lane and stopping about 50 yards from the Kloss House. The 3D model showed the kitchen door position, wind direction, and nighttime sightlines exactly as described. When reconstructing the bullet trajectories, technicians used a Mossberg 12-gauge shotgun and the same ammunition type listed in the file, firing at the angle Patterson described. The results matched the 1956 ballistic report. The first round, fired at 1.8 meters, struck James Kloss directly in the left chest. The second passed through the bathroom door, consistent with the splintered wood fragments noted in the old record. There was no significant deviation. Lydia watched on the simulation monitor as the bullet paths and body positions perfectly overlaid the historical crime scene photos. The next step recreated Patterson's route, transporting the victim home. Using map data, the team calculated an average travel time of approximately 22 minutes in a 1954 Ford truck from the Kloss House to Patterson's, fitting the gap in the interrupted 911 call record. When simulating sound, technicians reproduced the noise of a Ford truck engine and the gunshots at night. The results showed that given wind direction and the low-lying terrain, no neighbors could have clearly heard the full incident. In the final phase, the team focused on the shed area where Anna was held. They laser scanned the remaining structure and built a 3D model of the cellar based on Patterson's description. The scan revealed a void beneath the concrete, approximately 1.2 meters deep and 2.4 meters wide, originally reinforced with wooden planks and later filled in. Old drill holes in the wall matched the exact spots Patterson said he had attached iron chains to restrain the victim's wrists. On the patched concrete, rust stains from nails still corresponded to the positions of the oil lamp he said he hung for light when descending. Every detail was reconstructed accurately. When all data was compiled, the 3D model displayed the complete movement path from the moment Patterson stood behind the Kloss House, fired, dragged the victim through the yard, until the truck left Maple Road and stopped in his own yard. Each movement was simulated in real time, matching the confession second for second. At the model's end, the team rendered the cellar diagram, a small space with no escape, wood plank floor, containing only an old blanket and a metal bucket, exactly as Patterson described. The simulation system incorporated 1956 weather data for temperature, light, and humidity, showing an oppressive, cold, dark environment, barely large enough for one person to sit. Forensic experts concluded that Anna Kloss was held there continuously for the entire 88 days, based on Patterson's timeline, the matching physical traces, and remaining evidence. The team's final report stated clearly, 3D modeling analysis and physical evidence cross-verification confirmed the full sequence of events, from entry, ballistics, body transport, to the holding structure. The victim was detained against her will for approximately 88 days prior to death. Reading the conclusion, Lydia felt every piece Henry Lamb had left behind finally fit into a complete picture, a painful but absolutely precise image in which the truth of 1956 was no longer hypothesis, but a fully proven sequence rebuilt in the three-dimensional space of 2011, confirming that Anna Kloss's disappearance was not the story of a lost child, but a deliberate crime fully recreated after more than half a century awaiting justice. Once the 3D model was complete and the forensic conclusions confirmed, Lydia Freeman began the final phase of the investigation, compiling all evidence into the official prosecution file for case CL 1456A. In her Hartford office, she arranged every document in order: DNA results, physical evidence, crime scene photos, interrogation transcripts, and the reconstruction report. Each item carried detailed notes, numbering, and codes matching the original sealed chain of custody. The first binder contained 8 independent DNA reports from 3 separate labs: hair, bone, fabric, and indirect samples from Patterson's belongings. All pointed to the same genetic match: victim Anna Kloss and perpetrator Jacob L. Patterson. The second binder held physical evidence: the silver bracelet engraved AC, the tin box containing glasses, oil-stained fabric scraps, and old concrete samples from the shed floor. Alongside were detailed photos of rust traces, concrete patching, cellar structure diagrams, and the 3D laser scan drawings. Lydia labeled each evidence bag, red for direct exhibits, blue for supporting evidence. The third binder was Patterson's 40-page statement with line-by-line comparison to Henry Lamb's 1956 report. She noted in the margin, "Statement matches perfectly in actions, timing, location, sequence, and instruments used." The fourth was the state technical team's 3D modeling report, simulating the entire crime from the shooting at the Kloss house to burying the body under concrete. 312 pages containing 86 images, 14 bullet trajectory graphs, and detailed truck route maps. Lydia added a 12-page plain language legal summary for the prosecutors. She bound each section into hard covers numbered 1 through 6, and labeled them CL 1456, a 2011 complete prosecution file. When everything was perfectly organized, Lydia wrote the final consolidated report. The document considered the closure of more than half a century of investigation, based on DNA evidence, physical evidence, suspect confession, original file comparison, scene modeling, and forensic data. The criminal acts of Jacob L. Patterson on the night of October 14, 1956, resulting in the death of 13-year-old Ashford resident Anna Kloss, are established. All physical, biological, and testimonial evidence is consistent with no contradictions. The report's final section stated, "Recommendation to indict for first-degree murder and unlawful kidnapping and imprisonment." On July 28, 2011, Lydia, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, and Chief Prosecutor Samuel Reed signed the submission form. They delivered the 6 binders in 2 sealed boxes to the Connecticut Attorney General's office. The clerk received them, verified the seals, and stamped "Received." July 28, 2011, Office of the Attorney General. In the conference room, Prosecutor Reed flipped through the pages, skimmed the sections, then said slowly, "This is the most complete file I've ever received on a case unsolved for over half a century." Lydia replied, "My grandfather started it. I just finished the rest." Reed smiled, signed the final document, and officially moved case CL 1456A to the prosecution phase. As she stepped out of the building, Lydia paused under the light rain falling over Hartford. She knew that from this moment, the 1956 case had officially been brought back before justice. In her duty notebook, she wrote the final entry for the investigation phase: All evidence consolidated and submitted to the State Prosecutor's Office. File CL 1456 head, K complete, consistent, sufficient for prosecution. 60 years of investigation closed with undeniable truth. After the State Prosecutor's Office received the full 6 binders from the investigation team, Chief Prosecutor Samuel Reed began preparing for trial. He and his legal team drafted an indictment over 200 pages long, analyzing every piece of evidence in detail, from original physical items, forensic reports, DNA results, to the 3D scene model. Each section was presented clearly to form the legal foundation for charges of first-degree murder and unlawful imprisonment. Reed spent more than a week organizing the chain of evidence chronologically, starting with the 1956 disappearance, Henry Lamb's initial investigation, the case being shelved. Its 2011 reopening, excavation, testing, and finally Patterson's confession. He also compiled the witness list, forensic specialist Wallace, DNA-led, the State Criminal Analysis Center's 3D team, scene simulation, the 2 Ashford excavation technicians who directly uncovered the remains, and Detective Lydia Freeman, lead investigator, representing the Cold Case Review Unit. Reed required each witness to prepare individual statements with diagrams and photos for courtroom presentation. Additionally, he contacted a Yale University forensic psychologist to provide behavioral analysis proving Patterson's motive of control and obsession, and premeditated kidnapping, countering any possible defense claim of temporary loss of control. Meanwhile, the court-appointed public defender Richard Halpern, who had represented many elderly defendants in old cases. Halpern argued that Patterson was 77, in poor health, with declining memory, and that crimes, if they occurred, happened too long ago to be accurately reconstructed. He filed a motion to dismiss the indictment, citing humanitarian limitations and cognitive incapacity. Prosecutor Reed immediately countered at the preliminary hearing, presenting medical reports from the nursing home, showing Patterson remained lucid, fully understood questions, and confessed in precise detail. The Hartford court reviewed the full file and ruled the defendant legally competent to stand trial. The motion to dismiss on age grounds was denied. Concurrently, Reed directed the technical team to produce a condensed 12-minute 3D simulation video to show the jury the entire crime sequence, a visual reconstruction based on the confession, bullet paths, and excavation data. He also requested large-screen DNA comparison charts proving the undeniable link between Patterson and the evidence. Henry Lamb's original 1956 documents were restored, laminated, and marked Exhibit A as historical evidence. In the questioning plan, Reed scheduled Lydia as the first witness because the story connecting 2 generations of investigators, Henry and Lydia, was symbolic and reinforced the 60-year evidence chain. She would be followed by Wallace and the forensic team, then the technical experts, and finally the 3D presentation. On August 9, 2011, the indictment was completed and formally filed with the Hartford District Court, accompanied by the witness list and a request for trial within 1 month. At the prosecution team's final meeting, Reed looked around the table and said, "We are bringing a case into the light. After 60 years, no one here is allowed to treat this as mere procedure." Lydia nodded, knowing that every detail, every page in that 200-page file, represented not only justice but a long-overdue answer to her grandfather Henry Lamb, who had ended his own report with the words, "insufficient evidence." Now, 60 years later, the evidence was sufficient, and justice was finally ready to speak. On September 12, 2011, the Hartford District Court opened the formal trial of State of Connecticut v. Jacob L. Patterson, a case frozen for more than half a century. Courtroom 3 was packed with media, legal observers, and residents from Ashford. Lydia Freeman sat in the investigators' row. In front of her were Chief Prosecutor Samuel Reed and the state's legal team. Across the aisle, Patterson sat silently in a wheelchair, wearing a pale gray jacket, his wrinkled face still carrying sharp, cold eyes, flanked by public defender Richard Halpern. When the clerk read the full indictment, the air in the room grew thick. Reed opened the prosecution's case with a brief but clear summary. We are here to close the oldest criminal case in Connecticut history. All evidence from DNA and physical items to the defendant's own confession leads to one conclusion. Jacob L. Patterson murdered Anna Kloss on the night of October 14, 1956, and buried her body beneath his own floor. Following the opening, Reed called his first witness, Detective Lydia Freeman. She took the stand holding her grandfather's original Henry Lamb file and recounted the reinvestigation, excavation, DNA testing, and how every piece matched the 1956 records. When she quoted Henry's line, "Insufficient evidence," the courtroom fell silent. Next was lead forensic specialist Wallace, who presented the detailed DNA results. Genetic sequences from hair, bone, and skin matched the Kloss family. Oil-stained fabric and items from Patterson's possessions matched the suspect perfectly. Wallace explained how modern technology identified the chains despite evidence being stored over 50 years. He concluded, "There is no possibility of error. Every trace points to one man, Jacob L. Patterson." The criminalistics team then screened the 3D reconstruction, accurately recreating the crime: Patterson breaking into the Kloss home, firing, dragging Anna to the truck, and holding her in the cellar for 88 days, complete with light, sound, and real spatial data. When the simulation ended with Patterson pouring concrete over the body, many in the gallery wept. Reed closed the physical evidence portion by displaying the actual sealed items: the silver AC bracelet, the tin glasses case, the oil-stained cloth. He said, "These objects lay in darkness under concrete for 60 years, waiting to see light and to speak." In cross-examination, Halpern argued Patterson was too old and frail, his memory unreliable, and the confession possibly influenced by leading questions. He invoked the passage of time, claiming nothing that happened in 1956 can be stated with absolute certainty. Prosecutor Reed countered with data, the line-by-line match between Patterson's confession and Henry Lamb's report, the 3D model, confirming the shed structure, and DNA reinforcing physical proof. Reed stated, "No human memory could fabricate details accurate to the millimeter unless the person was actually there." The 12-member jury reviewed all evidence over 2 days. They listened again to the recorded confession, in which Patterson admitted, "I shot her parents and kept her for 88 days." The recording played over the speakers, Patterson's voice shaky, low, and clear, leaving the room in total silence. On the third day, Patterson was allowed to speak. He rose slowly, leaning on the wheelchair. Voice hoarse, "I did a terrible thing. I have no excuse left. I'm sorry, but I know nothing is enough to fix it." His words changed nothing. The jury took less than 4 hours to reach a verdict. The foreperson stood and read, "We, the jury of the Hartford District Court, find the defendant, Jacob L. Patterson, guilty of first-degree murder." A wave of murmurs swept the room. Reed sat upright, eyes fixed on Patterson, while Lydia lowered her head, hands clenched. Judge Ellen Hargrove delivered the sentence that same afternoon. She read slowly. Based on the jury verdict and irrefutable evidence, the Hartford District Court sentences Jacob L. Patterson to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. All rights to clemency or reduction are revoked. The sentence is effective immediately. The courtroom was dead silent, except for the dry scratch of the judge's pen. Patterson sat motionless, eyes distant, then gave a slight nod without protest. As court officers wheeled him out, Lydia stood and watched. She felt no triumph, only an indescribable emptiness at the closing of a case where justice had arrived more than half a century late. Prosecutor Reed approached and shook her hand, saying quietly, "Your grandfather can rest now." She replied, voice breaking, "Yes, he was right from the beginning." Outside the courthouse, light rain fell over Hartford, while crowds of residents and reporters gathered. A journalist asked Lydia how she felt. She answered only, "This is not an ending, it is the truth. Return to its proper place." Then she walked into the rain, still holding Henry Lamb's old file, the faded brown cover, bearing the single line, CL 1456, Ashford case. More than half a century had passed from the day Henry wrote insufficient evidence to the verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. Everything closed in a small Hartford courtroom, where justice was finally spoken amid falling rain and the silence of time. After the Hartford trial concluded, Lydia Freeman and the Cold Case Review Unit team were assigned the task of compiling the entire investigation process to serve research, professional development, and training purposes. The Connecticut Attorney General's office required a comprehensive technical report that documented every stage of the reinvestigation, from the reopening of the file in 2011 until the case was closed with a sentence of life imprisonment without parole. Lydia was the lead author, working alongside the forensic technical team, judicial editor, and legal advisor Samuel Reed. For 2 months they worked in Hartford, reviewing every document, photograph, transcript, DNA data, and 3D map to ensure every detail was recorded accurately. The report was titled Re-Examining Legacy Evidence, the Ashford Cold Case Study, and consisted of 5 main sections: archival file review procedures, re-examination of physical evidence, crime scene excavation, DNA result comparison, and digital crime scene reconstruction. Lydia wrote the introduction, outlining the multi-layered approach that combined forensic science with traditional investigative methods, and stated clearly that case CL 1456A was a landmark example of applying next-generation DNA technology to decades-old files. She described in detail the evidence preservation process. The cloth bag, jacket, and machine oil samples had remained continuously sealed from 1958 to 2011, proving the value of an unbroken chain of custody in long-term cases. The second section, written by technician Wallace, focused on the process of extracting DNA from heavily degraded samples. He noted the use of trace amplification methods and gene sequence reconstruction techniques, emphasizing that DNA samples stored under proper conditions can retain identification value for more than half a century. The third section analyzed the excavation at the Patterson house, including descriptions of the cement structure, the sequence of drilling and cutting, soil sampling techniques, and scene documentation. Each step was illustrated with technical diagrams, confirming the accuracy of the process and the coordination between forensic specialists, structural engineers, and field investigators. In the conclusion of this section, Lydia wrote, "The reliability of discoveries depends not only on technology, but on the ability to maintain evidence chain integrity across generations of investigators." The report also examined in detail the 1956 Henry Lamb case file, treating it as the foundation of the entire modernization effort. Lydia devoted an entire chapter to comparing Henry's handwritten notes with the 2011 digitized system, concluding that meticulousness, detailed record-keeping, and professional integrity were the factors that enabled the case to be successfully reopened. The fourth section described the 3D crime scene reconstruction technology, the first time it had been used in Connecticut for an archived case, employing laser scanning, terrain analysis, and light simulation to recreate the nighttime conditions of 1956. The resulting data was later adopted as a standard for subsequent historical investigations. The final section, Findings and Recommendations, presented 6 operational recommendations from Lydia and the investigation team. 1. Physical evidence storage for a minimum of 75 years. 2. Digitization of old investigation files. 3. Creation of a statewide cold case catalog. 4. Periodic coordination with forensic labs for evidence re-examination. 5. Establishment of long-term DNA preservation protocols. And 6. Encouragement of training for the next generation of investigators through historical cases. The report was completed after 7 weeks, totaling 427 pages, with appendices containing photographs, charts, and a reference list. On December 5, 2011, Lydia and Lieutenant Colonel Hayes presented the final draft to the Connecticut Attorney General's office. The Attorney General signed for receipt and sent an official letter of thanks, stating that the report is a benchmark document for the investigation of archived cases and marks the fusion of tradition with modern forensic science. As she stepped out of the administration building, Lydia held the first printed copy, light gray cover, bold black lettering, re-examining legacy evidence. CL 1456 AB, the Ashford case. She stared at the title for a long time, understanding that the final technical chapter was complete. The case her grandfather had begun more than half a century earlier had now become an exemplary investigative lesson for the state, preserved as proof of the unwavering belief of those in the profession that no matter how much time passes, honest evidence will always find its way back to the light. After the technical report, re-examining legacy evidence was submitted. The Connecticut Attorney General's office established a special panel to evaluate why the original 1956 investigation had failed. The 8-member panel consisted of forensic experts, investigative advisors, state prosecutors, and 3 retired officers who had worked in the mid-20th century investigative system. Lydia Freeman was invited as an honorary advisor to provide historical context and Henry Lamb's original documents. The first meeting took place in early January 2012, in a second-floor conference room of the Hartford Administration Building, where the entire CL 1456 file was spread across a long table. Black and white photographs, crime scene diagrams, old interrogation transcripts, examination reports, and the 1958 conclusion stamped, "Investigation suspended, insufficient evidence." The panel's objective was to systematically analyze every factor that prevented the case from being solved at the time, in order to draw lessons for future investigative procedures. The evaluation report began by stating that the 1956 failure did not stem from individual negligence, but from objective limitations of the era. First and foremost was the constraint of forensic technology. DNA analysis did not exist. Biological sample analysis relied on optical microscopes and manual observation. Samples such as hair, fibers, and blood traces degraded quickly without cold storage protocols, losing their evidentiary value. Second was the lack of interagency coordination. Local police, state troopers, and the forensic lab operated in silos. Files passed through multiple levels without a unified chain of custody system. Items such as oil-stained cloth fragments, the bracelet or tire tracks, were merely noted in reports without centralized storage, making later verification difficult. Third was outdated investigative procedure. According to Henry Lamb's records, only 2 investigators directly processed the scene, with no dedicated forensic specialist or photographer. Crime scene photos were poorly exposed, measurements were inaccurate, and reconstructing the scene was nearly impossible for decades. Additionally, societal factors were considered indirect causes. At the time, missing child cases were often classified as runaway or temporarily lost, causing police to delay response in the critical first 24 hours and miss the chance to collect initial traces. The panel's internal report noted, had current early alert protocols for missing children been in place, the likelihood of locating the victim within the first 72 hours would have been more than 60% higher. The panel also highlighted another shortcoming, lack of specialized training for local investigators. In 1956, Henry Lamb essentially worked alone, simultaneously serving as commander, coordinator, and evidence collector. All decisions relied on personal experience rather than technical standards. Nevertheless, the panel praised Henry's diligence and professional intuition. Many of his hypotheses, though unprovable at the time, were later confirmed by modern science. The panel's interim conclusion stated clearly, Case CL 1456A was not a failure of the investigators, but a failure of the pre-scientific forensic system and investigative model. In its reform recommendations, the panel proposed 5 groups of solutions. First, establish specialized investigative protocols for missing children, equivalent to today's emergency alert systems, ensuring every report is processed within the first hour. Second, create a long-term evidence storage network, including cold storage regulations and immediate digitization upon collection. Third, strengthen basic forensic training for local police to reduce complete dependence on state-level resources. Fourth, implement an electronic chain of custody tracking system that allows real-time monitoring of evidence status throughout an investigation. And finally, institute periodic reviews of unsolved cases, at least annually, to ensure no case is ever completely forgotten. The 187-page evaluation report was completed at the end of March 2012 and submitted to the Attorney General's office. In the accompanying letter, the panel wrote, "The Ashford case CL 1456A is a reminder that justice may be delayed by time, but it cannot be erased. It is the responsibility of subsequent generations to ensure it never happens again." When Lydia Freeman signed the last page, she felt that her grandfather's words, "insufficient evidence," had been rewritten with new meaning, no longer a mark of failure, but the starting point for comprehensive change in how Connecticut views and investigates missing child cases. In June 2012, after the internal panel released its evaluation of the reasons for the 1956 investigative failure and its system reform recommendations, the Connecticut Department of Justice formally drafted a bill titled the Connecticut Evidence Preservation Act 2012. The proposed legislation was a direct outcome of Case CL 1456A and Lydia Freeman's team's technical report, Re-examining Legacy Evidence, intended to create a new legal framework for the long-term preservation of criminal evidence. The draft, prepared by the Attorney General's office in coordination with the State Legislative Committee, contained 42 articles centered on three pillars: permanent evidence storage regulations, the right to request DNA retesting, and a cross-generational evidence custody oversight mechanism. On July 12, 2012, the State Attorney General presented the bill to the Assembly Judiciary Committee, opening with the statement, "The Ashford case is not only a story of restored justice, it is proof of the importance of physical evidence in connecting past and present." Under the proposal, all evidence related to homicide, missing persons, sexual assault, or violent crime would be stored permanently, with no time limit unless a state Supreme Court ordered destruction. All biological samples would be kept in controlled temperature conditions, logged electronically, inspected annually, and resealed. Notably, Article 17 stipulated, any individual convicted before 1990 has the right to petition for DNA retesting if original evidence still exists. This provision was informally called the Patterson Clause in honor of the case that paved the way for the change. Lydia Freeman was invited to the hearing as an expert witness, where she explained the chain of custody in case CL 1456A and the value of long-term physical preservation. She described how a cloth bag sealed in 1958 still contained viable DNA, capable of solving the case more than half a century later. Lawmakers cited her testimony as living proof in support of the bill. After 3 rounds of debate, on September 28, 2012, the Connecticut House of Representatives passed the bill by a vote of 92-4. 1 month later, the Senate approved it in full and sent it to the governor for signature. The Connecticut Evidence Preservation Act 2012 officially took effect on January 1, 2013. Becoming the first state law requiring permanent evidence storage and unlimited DNA re-examination rights. The Department of Justice created a dedicated Evidence Preservation Bureau under the Office of Criminal Justice, responsible for operating the central storage facility and managing the digitized evidence identification system. The act also mandated public access to non-sensitive evidence databases to assist researchers and forensic organizations. At the signing ceremony, the Attorney General stated, "We cannot bring back the past, but we can ensure that no evidence is ever buried with it." In the front row, Lydia Freeman quietly held her grandfather's old red evidence seal stamped CL 1456A Ashford case. That small item had now become the symbol of a new Connecticut law in which justice is protected not only by people, but by memories preserved in evidence that never disappears. In early 2013, after the Connecticut Evidence Preservation Act took effect, the State Department of Justice completed the handover of exemplary case files to the National Cold Case Archive in Silver Spring, Maryland. Among the first batch was file CL 1456A. The Ashford case was regarded as a model for applying modern forensic technology to historical files. On February 10, 2013, a Hartford delegation delivered 2 sealed boxes containing all original evidence, technical copies, digital data, and investigation reports. Each item was packed in moisture-proof bags, labeled in red, Historic Case Priority Storage. Upon arrival at the National Archive, Federal Justice Department staff prepared an official receipt and assigned the new identifier NCCT 1456, a standardized code consisting of national prefix, state code, and the original case number. In the climate-controlled warehouse, maintained at 12 degrees Celsius and 45% humidity, the items were placed in the Legacy Collection section, reserved for historical cases from 1940 to 1970. National forensic technicians performed 3D scans of every piece of evidence: the silver bracelet engraved AC, the tin eyeglass case, the oil-stained cloth fragment, excavation photos, and Henry Lamb's original map. Each item received its own QR code linked to the central database. At the same time, all of Henry Lamb's and Lydia Freeman's paper records were digitized at 1200 dpi and saved in PDF format for long-term preservation. DNA data, test results, and the 3D scene model were transferred to the FBI's secure server with national standard metadata descriptions. The digitization process lasted 3 weeks, producing 47 GB of data divided into 86 files, each bearing an electronic signature and SHA-256 authentication hash. The handover report stated, File Cell 1456A, Connecticut, 1956, completed transfer. National Cold Case Archive, Division 4B, Rack 17. Upon completion, Lydia received an official letter from the Director of the National Archives confirming that the Ashford case had become part of the United States National Cold Case Collection, alongside other famous decades-old solved cases. The letter read, File NCCT 1456A demonstrates the progress of forensic investigation and shows how one generation can complete the work begun by another. This case will be used as teaching and research material at national forensic academies. Lydia visited the Silver Spring facility in April of that year and stood before the bulletproof glass storage room where the evidence was displayed in a restricted exhibition area. She saw the silver bracelet engraved AC lying in a small display case, white light reflecting off its tarnished surface, beneath a plaque that read, Anna Kloss, Ashford, 1956. Evidence preserved, justice restored. She lightly touched the glass, feeling that everything had finally come full circle and returned to where it belonged. In another corner, a reproduction of Henry Lamb's 1958 signature from the original report hung beside her own signature from the 2011 report, 2 signatures separated by more than half a century, now side by side in the same frame. As she left the center, Lydia was given an honorary access card that allows her to monitor file NCCT 1456A online in the national database. She knew that from this point forward, the Ashford case was no longer just one family's memory. It had become part of United States judicial history, where every piece of evidence, every mistake, and the perseverance of those who came before are preserved forever as a reminder that justice, however late, is never truly lost. After the CL 1456A file was transferred to the National Cold Case Archive and recoded as NCCT 1456A, Lydia Freeman spent the following months completing her final task, writing a comprehensive final report on the entire course of the case, from the initial 1956 investigation to the trial and closure in 2011. She worked alone in the small office of the Cold Case Review Unit in Hartford, her desk buried under documents, technical copies, and Henry Lamb's handwritten notes that she had restored from the original files. The report was simply titled, Ashford Investigation 1956-2011, Final Comprehensive Review. The introduction presented the historical context, an era when missing child cases had no emergency response protocols, when forensic science still relied on intuition and human dedication. Lydia wrote that the Anna Kloss case is a microcosm of the limits of its time and the endurance of professional conscience. The second section summarized her grandfather's investigation. Police Chief Henry Lamb, from the night he received the missing person call, through the search, evidence logging, suspicion falling on Patterson, to the moment he was forced to shelve the file for lack of legal tools. She preserved his descriptive tone, interspersing direct quotes from his original journal. If the truth lies beneath the soil, time will find a way to reveal it. The third section reconstructed the 2011 reopening. The review process, DNA retesting, excavation, file cross-referencing, and crime scene reconstruction. Lydia detailed every step, every decision, every critical date. She noted how each new discovery perfectly matched Henry's original hypothesis, from the cement residue in Patterson's basement to the location of the bracelet and the machine oil sample. She devoted an entire chapter to analyzing the resonance between old-school investigation and modern science. One side intuition, the other quantitative evidence. When they meet, the truth can no longer be concealed. In the fourth section, Lydia compiled the legal and societal impacts that followed the case: the birth of the 2012 Evidence Preservation Act, the establishment of the Evidence Custody Bureau, and the transfer of the Ashford file into the National Archive. She wrote, "From a small house in Ashford, the story spread across the state and became the foundation for legal reform, so that every piece of evidence, no matter how old, would have a chance to speak again." The fifth section was the heaviest. She recounted the Hartford trial, Patterson's confession, his vacant stare as the sentence was read, and her own feelings when Prosecutor Reed said, "Your grandfather can rest now." Lydia avoided legal jargon here and wrote it as a personal narrative. Justice does not turn back time, but at least it puts the past in its proper place. In the conclusion, Lydia drew professional lessons: the value of perseverance, the importance of preservation, and the power of collective memory in investigations. She wrote, "File Cell 1456A is no longer just the story of one victim and one perpetrator. It is proof that justice can be preserved through paper, ink, and loyalty to the truth." The finished report was 312 pages long, with an appendix containing a parallel 1956-2011 timeline that aligned every event across the two generations. On August 19, 2013, Lydia printed the final version on archival paper, signed every page, and added a short dedication on the last page. For Henry Lamb, who began this journey believing that truth does not die, it only waits to be found. She signed beneath it in blue ink, her signature overlapping the faded copy of her grandfather's original signature she had reproduced from the old file. When she sent the report to the Office of the Attorney General and the National Archives, Lydia kept one copy for herself and placed it in a glass frame on her desk. The gray cover bore small lettering, "Ashford Investigation, 1956-2011. She looked at it for a long time, then whispered into the empty room, "We're done, Grandpa." In 2014, after Lydia Freeman's final report was widely released within academic and judicial circles, the University of Connecticut, in collaboration with the Connecticut Department of Justice and the National Forensic Science Institute, officially launched a new course titled Legacy Evidence Analysis. It was the first program in the United States focused entirely on the study, analysis, and re-examination of evidence in long-dormant cases, built completely around the model of CL 1456A, the Ashford case. Developed by the Department of Criminology and Forensic Science, the 6-month course combined theory and practice. At the opening session, Professor Thomas Villain, Chair of Forensic Science, declared, "The Kloss case proved that no case is ever truly closed as long as evidence still exists. This course exists to ensure that lesson is never forgotten." The curriculum had three main parts. The first, forensic continuity and evidence integrity, was taught by Lydia Freeman herself and examined evidence preservation across generations, introduced DNA traceback methods in aged samples, and stressed chain of custody integrity. She used CL 1456A as the primary example, projecting 3D crime scene models, excavation photos, and Henry Lamb's original maps for students to study firsthand. The second part, reconstruction of historical crime scenes, was led by state forensic specialists and trained students to rebuild scenes using laser-scanned data and digital modeling, simulate bullet trajectories, determine time of death, and restore the physical environment of old cases. Students were required to fully reconstruct the 1956 Ashford scene on modern forensic software using digitized original documents coded NCCT 1456A from the National Archive. The final part, judicial and ethical review, was taught by prosecutor Samuel Reed and addressed the ethical, legal, and statute of limitation issues in reopening cold cases. He recounted the Patterson prosecution, how the jury handled decades-old evidence, and the role DNA played in transforming the state's entire justice system. The course drew large numbers of students, as well as active police officers, investigators, and forensic personnel from many other states. The University of Connecticut simultaneously opened a dedicated practice lab, the Legacy Evidence Lab, which housed 3D replicas, sample evidence, and excavation simulation equipment for research. There, students practiced modern evidence analysis and compared it to Henry Lamb's traditional methods. On the lab wall hung two large photographs, a black and white image of Henry in 1956 and a color image of Lydia in 2011, beneath the words, "Two generations, one pursuit. Truth." Forensic Studies Quarterly ran a feature article calling it a pioneering educational model that connects investigative history with modern forensics. The Connecticut Department of Justice later proposed making the Legacy Evidence Analysis module mandatory training for state police, turning the Claus case into official curriculum for new investigators. Many forensic programs across the country, including the University of California, Michigan State, and NYU, adopted the syllabus to launch similar courses. In October 2014, during the University of Connecticut's Academic Festival, Lydia was invited to the stage for special recognition of her contribution to the program. In her speech, she said, "I don't teach students how to solve cases. I teach them how to listen to evidence that seems to have gone silent. Because sometimes, the things we forget are the most honest witnesses of all." The auditorium rose in a standing ovation. In the university's academic records, CL 1456A is listed as Case Study Alpha, the foundational case of the legacy evidence analysis discipline. Ever since, every class since has begun with the same Henry Lamb quote, engraved on a metal plaque at the lab entrance. "If the truth lies beneath the soil, time will find a way to reveal it." In early 2015, nearly 60 years after the night little Anna Claus vanished from the town of Ashford, the Connecticut State Police officially announced that file CL 1456A was fully and permanently closed. The press conference was held at the Cold Case Review Unit headquarters in Hartford, the same building where the case had been reopened 4 years earlier. The room was small but packed. Representatives from the Department of Justice, investigators, forensic experts, University of Connecticut students, and reporters who had followed the reinvestigation from the start. On the podium, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who had overseen the entire 2011-2013 phase, began slowly. "Today we declare that case CL 1456A, also known as the Ashford case, is fully resolved. All evidence, DNA tests, statements, and the conviction have been legally confirmed. This file is officially closed." He paused, looked around the room and added, "This is the oldest cold case in Connecticut history solved through scientific methods." Behind him, a screen displayed the timeline from 1956 to 2011, Key milestones interspersed with photos of the two generations of investigators. Henry Lamb in black and white holding his notebook, and Lydia Freeman in color standing before the 3D crime scene model. When the slide stopped at 2011, an image appeared of the silver bracelet engraved AC, with the caption, "Evidence recovered after 55 years." The room fell silent. A representative from the Attorney General's office read the official statement. Upon full review, CL 1456A is recorded as the first cold case in the state resolved entirely through re-examination of archived evidence. This case will be preserved in the national records as a milestone in American criminal investigation. Lydia sat in the front row, quietly watching. Beside her was Samuel Reed, the prosecutor who had been decisive at the Hartford trial. When invited to speak, Lydia stepped to the podium holding her grandfather's original Red Seal evidence card, the wax still faintly showing ink. She said, "This case is not only justice for one little girl, it is proof that evidence never dies. It only sleeps, waiting for someone patient enough to wake it." She paused a few seconds, then added, "On behalf of everyone in this profession, I want to thank Henry Lamb, the man who started this journey when science wasn't yet able to help him finish it." Applause lasted nearly a minute. Newspapers unanimously ran headlines. The 55-year case, how Connecticut solved its oldest cold case. Legal journals and federal agencies cited the Claus case as a standard model for historical investigations and praised Connecticut for becoming the first state to enact permanent evidence retention regulation. In the U.S. Department of Justice's annual report that year, CL 1456A, was listed among landmark cold case resolutions, alongside other famous DNA-solved cases. That same year in Ashford, local authorities erected a small memorial stone beside the lake, where Anna's green jacket had once been found. It reads, "In memory of Anna Claus 1943-1956, justice found after 55 years." Below are two smaller names side by side, Henry Lamb and Lydia Freeman, with the note investigators. The dedication ceremony was simple, just a few townspeople who had joined the original search, plus some University of Connecticut interns. Lydia stood quietly before the calm water, a light wind carrying the sound of dry leaves. She felt the circle of time had finally closed from the small house where Henry once answered the missing person call to the National Archive, where the evidence is now preserved forever. In an internal report released after the announcement, the Connecticut Department of Justice wrote, "The Claus case marks a turning point in modern justice, proving that evidence preservation and respect for investigative legacy are the foundation for connecting justice across generations." The report is stored in Hartford, along with a 3D model copy and all digitized data. Lydia returned to the Cold Case Review Unit office at the end of March. On her desk, file CL 1456A now bore the stamp resolved in deep red. She placed next to it the black and white photo of Henry. Afternoon light streamed through the window, falling across the two files, old and new, lying side by side. She opened her professional journal and wrote the final entry. March 25, 2015. The Connecticut State Police have declared CL 1456A officially closed. The file is recorded as a cold case resolved after 55 years. Justice was late, but it came. When she closed the notebook, the room fell silent. Outside the window, a light Hartford spring rain, one of the rare ones in the Northeast, fell steadily on the glass, its pale reflection like the slowed rhythm of time itself. Far away in the National Archive in Silver Spring, record NCCT 1456A glowed on the system with the status "Closed, Resolved," marking the end of 6 decades of investigation that began in 1956 in the steadfast heart of a police chief named Henry Lamb and concluded with the signature of his granddaughter of the same blood, Lydia Freeman, the second generation, who fulfilled the promise that justice, however slow, can still find its way home. The story of KCL 1456A in Ashford, Connecticut, is not only the tragedy of one family, It also reflects the core values of American society. The belief that justice may be delayed, but never lost. More than half a century of investigation, from Henry Lamb alone, recording faint traces in 1956, to Lydia Freeman reopening the case with modern DNA technology in 2011, shows one thing: truth can only be found when people remain persistent and honest in their profession. That very persistence helped give birth to the Evidence Preservation Act of 2012, ensuring evidence is kept forever, a practical reform that still affects the U.S. justice system today. From a human perspective, the story offers every American a lesson in intergenerational responsibility. The efforts of one generation are never wasted; they simply wait for the next to carry them forward. Lydia did not merely solve a case, she completed her grandfather's unfinished wish, proving that determination can transcend the limits of time and technology. In today's era, when American society faces loss of trust, polarization, and the rapid forgetting of information, this story reminds us that values like responsibility, integrity, and patience remain the foundation for upholding justice and public faith. Every small act, from preserving documents and respecting procedure to never stopping the search for truth, contributes to a fairer society. As Henry Lamb once wrote in his notebook, "If the truth lies beneath the soil, time will find a way to reveal it." And in American life today, those words still ring true. If you believe that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will one day be found, please hit subscribe so we can keep exploring cold cases like CL 1456 together. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where justice is called by name again, no matter how much time has passed.